Well, hello everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. So thank you very much to Monique for inviting me. I haven't got very much time, so I'm going to just say very briefly, just to introduce myself. I'm a lesbian feminist. My work at the moment actually is on the UK Femicide Census. So I work building the database of all the women.
Femicide is, sorry, femicide, explain just what femicide is. I think they probably don't know.
Yeah, so the Femicide Census is a big database of catalogue information of women who've been killed by men in the United Kingdom. We've got a database covering 10 years. So that's my paid work at the moment, is working in that area. But I've got a background in research, in policy, and definitely in activism. And I'm coming from a lesbian feminist and a radical feminist perspective. In terms of the this issue of transgenderism, I've been active probably now for getting on for 10 years, best part of 10 years. I organized back in 2012, I was involved in organizing a conference called RadFem 2012, which was the first women-only conference in the United Kingdom for many years, maybe a couple of decades, because it became impossible to organize as women, and we wanted to organize a women-only conference. And that was the first conference that, because we explicitly include men who claim to be women, we were absolutely besieged and attacked for that. Do you think that's clear?
Yeah, you excluded, you wouldn't allow people men who claim to be women in, and you got a lot of trouble. You were attacked for that.
Yeah, very much so. And at that point in 2012, almost everybody was against us, including most of the lesbian and gay movement, most of the feminist movement. Most people were against us, or they just remained silent. So it was very sort of a very minority thing, those of us who realized that there was really a big problem with this. And then in 2016, I organized the first conference, I believe is the first conference that presented a feminist critique of transgenderism. And those videos are on my channel on YouTube. We've still got the presentations, which are still very and other mainly lesbian feminists. So anyway, so I've been around for quite a long time, but obviously now in the last probably around 2 or 3 years, it's really expanded. And you know, as Bev was alluding to, there are a lot of different groups that have come on board, which is great. It's incredible, really, how it's grown. So my talk then, my talk is in 2 halves. I want to talk first of all on the question of what is transgenderism, and then secondly, what are the implications of transgenderism for women and girls. Bev has already talked quite a lot about the latter part, so I'll try not to repeat anything that she said. So as I say, I'll come from a feminist perspective, a radical feminist perspective. I think we have to understand transgenderism as a manifestation of patriarchy. It is, if you look at the origins of it, we can see that it originates as a male fantasy. It originates in the minds of men who fantasize about being women, and also in terms of male fantasy of the doctors, the surgeons, the endocrinologists who want to try to bring about this fantasy. So the most important thing in my years of understanding this issue, I think the most important thing is we have to understand that transgenderism as a condition does not exist. It doesn't exist. It exists as an ideology. It exists as a set of beliefs and images and practices as an ideology, but not as a human condition, which I'll expand on. So as I say, transgenderism is a male fantasy that has, over the past decades, through language, through images, through practices, it's now assumed the status of reality which is actually based on a fiction. We understand it as a fiction if we look at the history of how it's developed. And that history is traced very well in the 20th and 21st centuries in Sheila Jeffrey's work, Gender Hurts, but there are also other books now that are tracing that history. And by understanding the history, we see that transgenderism is actually an elaborate fiction that has been produced through a combination of the original fantasy, male entitlement, medical and surgical technologies.
Oh, wait a minute, hang on a sec. I want to ask the Dutch people if they're following this, because it's, especially entitlement is a difficult word.
Yeah.
Dutch, could you put your hand up, I mean, if you think that Dutch people are finding this difficult to follow, or is everybody's okay? Okay, but perhaps you could just explain a bit more what entitlement is, because I think that's quite a difficult word for Dutch people to understand.
Okay, thanks. So entitlement is the feeling that if you want something, you should have it. It's a very sort of dominant sense of self that you have the right to have whatever you want, whatever you fantasize about. That's kind of translation. Okay. But also through practices such as medical and surgical technologies, also through profit motivation from surgeons, big pharmaceutical companies, and also from misogyny, because I think at the heart of it, it's misogyny for a man to believe that his fantasy means that he is a woman, and also as what we see in terms of what is happening, particularly to young lesbians, the destruction of women's bodies, I think is also illustrates that misogyny. And Sheila Jeffreys, I think quite rightly, talks about the transgender movement as a men's sexual rights movement. Now, obviously now we have, it's not just about men becoming women, because as Bev says, we have actually the most dramatic increase is in young women, and mainly young lesbians now believing that they are men. But we can see at the heart, we can see how that's developed. And I see these young women now caught up in this ideology of transgenderism that does not serve them well at all. So I think we have to be clear that there is no such thing as trans people, trans women, or trans men. I think we have to speak very clearly and understand exactly why that is not the case, why it's not possible. So if we start with some basic facts, we know, and there's a lot being written on this now, we know that human beings are sexually dimorphic, which just means that we reproduce through sexual reproduction, and that is based on us being divided into two sexes, male and female. And the word sex then refers to the biological nature of that individual, whether they are male or female. Now, it's true that a tiny proportion of the population are intersex, but even these people with these very rare conditions actually can still be identified as being male or female. Now, I'm not going to get into this whole area of intersex because it's a tiny proportion of the population. And we know that transgenderism doesn't involve intersex conditions, because a man who is claiming to be a trans woman is not intersex. He is a man with male anatomy who is claiming to be a trans woman. Now, we know that it is impossible to change your sex. We know that it is impossible to be born in the wrong body. There was a good book that came out on this, I think a couple of years ago. And we also know, this is such an important feminist understanding, that gender is not a property of the individual. We are not born with this thing called a gender or a gender identity. We understand it, and there's decades of feminist scholarship and understanding of this. We understand gender as a social and political system. And it's not a neutral system, it's a system that serves it's a system that serves patriarchy, because it serves to maintain men as the dominant sex class and women as a subordinate sex class. So therefore, it is not possible for someone to have an innate gender identity. it's a misunderstanding of what gender is to start making claims that it's somehow that we're born with it, or we have this innate gender identity that overrides our sex bodies. And I think if there are, I don't know if there are people who are joining us this evening who maybe have only just started to look at some of the policies around and the laws, the new laws coming in around transgenderism, you'll see that these laws and policies are based on a very, very confused misunderstanding of this relationship or the distinction between sex and gender. And as soon as you start to unpick, the definitions that they use, the whole thing really collapses, because it's based on this conflation of sex and gender. Okay. One of the reasons
conflation is a difficult word.
Oh, confusion. Using the two of them in an unclear way. Why I believe it's crucial to name men as men is because I'm coming from, as I say, a feminist perspective, and one of the things that is often left out of this discussion and understanding of this whole area is an appreciation and a consciousness that we live in a patriarchal society. We live in a male-dominated society. So one of the really crucial lessons of feminism is that we have to begin with clear language. So Mary Daly spoke about naming, Andrea Dworkin spoke about naming. The crucial thing is that we have to identify what men are doing what and who they are doing it to in the world, whether that's in the area of male violence against women, whether it's in the area of political representation. It's really important that we understand and feel that we are able and clear to name men as men. And then the whole area of transgenderism becomes much clearer. I believe that it's crucial not to talk about trans women or trans people, because these things are based on a set of definitions that don't withstand scrutiny. So I think it's crucial to talk about men who demand that we pretend that they are women. And as soon as we do that, what is going on becomes much clearer than if we use these fictitious terms such as trans women or non-binary or any of the other terms that rely on the kind of faulty logic of transgenderism. So the next part of my talk, which I'll go through quite quickly, is what is the impact of transgenderism on women and girls? So obviously, as soon as you have men occupying the category of women as a sex class, it brings innumerable problems, many, many problems. So I'm just going to outline some of them very briefly, and maybe we can talk about them more in the discussion. But there are plenty of examples of all of these that I'm telling you. So the first set of harms then result from men being included in this category of women. If this is accepted in the culture and enshrined in law and comes into the law, it has a lot of implications for women, including men gaining access to women's spaces. These include women's refuges, women's bathrooms and toilets, changing rooms, prisons, sports, leisure groups, things like political opportunities, employment opportunities, training schemes, special women's prizes, women's groups, and women's meetings. All of them are open up to men, so they are no longer women's spaces. Beverly mentioned the point that is particularly crucial for lesbians and lesbian communities. Obviously, lesbian relationships, lesbian lives, lesbian culture, communities is centered around women-only space. So if men start to invade that, you get some really terrible things happening, as Bev mentioned, the cotton ceiling, and in fact, what becomes a normalization of rape culture, because it becomes impossible to say no to men in those spaces. We also see things like violent crimes and sexual crimes committed by men increasingly being reported and even recorded in official statistics as crimes committed by women. So then everything we know about male violence against women then becomes misrepresented because they're being reported as women's crimes. We also get this misunderstanding of men as being considered as a particularly oppressed group of women, and women then actually put into this role of being in a privileged position because we're cis women in relation to these men. And in fact, what we see is the construction or the increasing kind of perception of women as an oppressor group in relation to these men who are victims. And we even have seen women, the attempt to criminalize women for speaking and naming them as men. You know, we've had court cases, legal actions taken by very aggressive misogynist trans activists trying to criminalize women for simply calling men men. And we see women getting removed from Twitter for doing exactly that. So increasingly then, any legal protection of what it is to be a woman becomes meaningless because it now includes men. Men increasingly control the language because words like woman or mother become outlawed. So we have these ridiculous terms like menstruator or a cervix haver or vagina haver, rather than saying women. And the actual naming of men is perceived as hate speech. That's true, actually, even within the gender critical movement, not many of us actually name men very clearly. I think another big harm is that we have the psychological manipulation of the entire culture on a massive scale, because we are being coercively controlled and forced to try to pretend that something is true when it isn't true. So I think that it's psychological abuse, and feminism actually becomes unspeakable, because you can't have an active, intellectually engaged feminism if your language is stolen from you. And if you can't gather together in your groups, then women's liberation becomes impossible. Sorry, I've probably just about up to my time now. So just to say quickly, Bev, I know, referred to the terrible harms being done to young lesbians and young gay men in terms of the puberty blockers and then breast binding going on usually or frequently to cross-sex hormones, etc. But also we have to be very alert to what is happening in schools. And in British schools at the moment, the UK government, the Department for Education, has endorsed Stonewall and promoted the resources of Stonewall to be taught in schools. So you have videos aimed at young children of 7 or 8, where a young girl in the video, who is clearly a young tomboy, boyish, or not feminine, the gender non-conforming young girl, who doesn't like doing stereotypical boy things, is then in this story, which is like the Cinderella story, she then transforms into a boy and realizes in the story that she was really a boy all along. And this is promoted by the UK government in schools, so it's really serious. We also have the problem of toilets and private spaces for girls also being opened up to boys in some schools, and that kind of push for that to happen. So in terms of children, there are a lot of very, very serious harms and consequences going on. So thank you. That's